So you can check all this stuff out on our website, iftf.org. And as I mentioned, we have a brand new course, IFTF Scenario Building, and this first one is coming this March. And building scenarios is a really important piece of futures thinking. So we're super excited about this offering, and this class is also going to be special because we're going to be using our own post-COVID scenarios that we just developed over the last year as our template, so you'll get to be immersed in that content. And you can find more about that training in the link that I'm just going to place now. And I'm sure you're not only familiar, but probably sick of being in Zooms at this point. But just in case, we're going to go over a couple suggestions for making this experience good for you. When you're chatting, remember to make sure you've selected all panelists and attendees, so you're actually communicating with everybody, not just an individual. And then also, if you're going to ask questions, please put it in the Q&A, not in the chat. That way we can not only keep track of all those questions, but also has the capability of upvoting a question, or so you can upvote a question or have your question upvoted. Lastly, you may note everyone's automatically muted and your videos have been turned off. And then finally, this webinar is being recorded and it will be made available on our website within the week, and we'll be sharing the link for that. So without further ado, I am very excited to introduce our guest for today's Foresight Talk. Alex Kelly is an organizer and artist committed to social and climate justice, and has worked in film, theater, communications, and troublemaking in many other forms. Through practicing the art of imagination, Alex hopes to strengthen our abilities to tackle the complex challenges we face by imagining more just futures. And David Pledger is an award-winning contemporary artist, curator, writer, cultural commentator, and thinker, working within and between the performing, visual, and media arts. He's artistic director of Not Yet, It's Difficult, one of Australia's seminal interdisciplinary arts companies. And today we're going to be talking to Alex and David about their collective that they co-founded called The Things We Did Next, to learn about their community and its practices and philosophies in imagining a more just, inclusive futures. The Things We Did Next is a collaborative practice that generates a series of interconnected artworks and projects based on collectively imagining multiple futures. We're going to dive into that today. Before we start our conversation today, I want to present a quick land acknowledgement. And this is a new practice I've been wanting to introduce, and today presented a particularly wonderful opportunity to get started with it. So as many of you may know, Institute for the Future is located in the city of Palo Alto in the San Francisco Bay, in an area sometimes known as the Silicon Valley. I'll put the orange star here. That shows where our offices are located. And while Silicon Valley reflects some of the endeavors that are happening today, I would like to extend our recognition that this area is also the unceded lands of the Ramaytush Ohlone people. And the Ohlone peoples were the original stewards of the Bay Area before their lands were taken from them and their culture was nearly decimated. I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from their land today, and acknowledge that it's all of our responsibilities, particularly as futurists, to develop futures that are inclusive and seek to reconcile our failures in the past to support people's right to all of their futures. So if you'd like to learn more about the Ramaytush peoples, you can find that in the link that we'll put in the chat. And if you'd like to learn more about the original peoples in your area, it's pretty easy to Google that. That's how I found out more about the Ohlone people here. Okay, so thank you so much. I'm going to actually stop sharing slides and introduce our guests in today, Alex and David. Welcome, David and Alex. Before we dive into learning more about the details of your work, can we start a little bit about talking about the philosophy your collective operates with? What role does Indigenous perspective play in your practice, particularly because people often associate Indigenous cultures with the past? And how does your work integrate the alternative perspectives into thinking about the future?
Great question. Let's just go big to start. We love it. I'm Alex. Hi, friends. Thank you so much for having us. This is sort of our first foray into conversations with capital F futurists. So hello, professional futurists and others interested. We're excited to hear your reflections on our explorations in this space. Our practice, all of our practice, both prior to this work and in this work, is incredibly values driven. And so we spend a lot of time thinking very deeply about how we can enact those values, both in the process of the work that we make and the content of the work, and then the way that the work sits in the world. And I think no matter where we are across the world, and certainly for many people who are joining across Turtle Island, and for those of us on the continent of so-called Australia, as you said, reckoning with our past and acknowledging the historic injustice and also the ideas and ideologies that allowed those injustices to happen is really critical. So on this continent, looking at the history of dispossession and genocide, but also without sort of trying to romanticize this either, because it's been very hard fought, but resilience and incredible leadership and cultural survival of First Nations people. You have to be dealing with those ideas and those histories and those truths and those presents and those futures. There's a brilliant Yorta Yorta futurist here in Australia called Cherie Minnicon, and she talks about the fact that First Nations people are the original futurists. And many First Nations people around the world also speak to the fact that they've already experienced apocalypses and collapses, mostly in the form of colonial upheaval. And therefore they bring incredible wisdom to fight climate change. And again, you know, in listening to those wisdoms, it's also, we need to listen in a non-extractive way. We can't sort of go, oh, you know, we've destroyed everything quick. Now let's turn to Indigenous wisdom and learn from them to fix things. This is a very different way of approaching how we draw from those wisdoms in a way that allows people to lead. So all of our practice is deeply collaborative with people from many different backgrounds, but we really centre Indigenous voices and wisdom and guidance. So we work with a lot of First Nations people. We read and research a lot of material. And I think we're humble and open to our existing prejudices and the fact that we're always learning. So yeah, that's a bit of a rave, but David, I'm sure you've got something to add too.
Hello, everybody. I'm coming to you, zooming in from the land of the Boonwurrung people in the Kulin Nation down in the southeast part of Australia. One of the ways in which what Alex was describing as the thinking and the values behind the practice, how that it goes into effect is that we like to hang on to the idea of in our collaborative practice that past, present, and future are temporally simultaneous. We don't feel, and I think feeling is really an important thing when you think about a futuring practice. We don't necessarily feel that we're in the present, in the past, or in the future, but there's a feeling that we are part of a continuum. And so what that allows us to do is it allows us to think more deeply about what's come before and what is here and what might be. And so potential arising out of the relationship between our pasts and our present really kind of enables a way of imagining and imagineering that that is as inclusive and as just as we can possibly make it, but also really as exciting and as stimulating and as provocative as we can possibly make it, so that there aren't any boundaries. And I think one of the things we'd probably like to see is we don't necessarily, certainly in our artistic practice, we don't really see boundaries between different art forms. Me personally, I'm actually not able to see the boundaries between art forms. I've never been able to do that. And I think one of the things that helps when you're futuring is that you can see a world above you, a world around you, and a world that you've come from.
Yeah, a lot of the work of featuring is about making connections, and not those connections aren't always obvious, and often we need new frameworks and new perspectives to help us see those kinds of connections. I want to talk so much about the work itself. I know you guys have put together a little slideshow just to give our audience a little bit of a taste of the work that you do and give a sense of kind of who's involved and what the philosophy is. So I wonder if you're up for sharing some of that right now.
Absolutely. I'll just share my screen. And just to start as well, I'm here in the south of Australia, north of the city known as Naarm or Melbourne, on Dja Dja Wurrung country, the land of the Jara people. And David is sort of to the south of me on Woi Wurrung, Wurundjeri and Boon Wurrung country in Naarm. As you can see, there's over 350 distinct nations across the continent of Australia. So just to kind of frame our conversation, I just wanted to draw attention to this quote from the writer Amitav Ghosh, who says, "When future generations look back, they will certainly blame the leaders and politicians of this time for their failures to address the climate crisis. But they may well hold the artists and writers equally culpable, for the imagining of possibilities is not after all the job of politicians and bureaucrats." So this is a little bit of a North Star for us in terms of recognising our responsibility as artists to rise to the challenges of the present moment, not just the climate crisis, but the rise in fascism, the breakdown in democracy, and the fragmentation of our media landscape. And we will come back to talk about this a little bit more, because whilst we see our role as artists as critically important, we think quite deeply about how to move beyond simply thinking about art as a tool. So we'll come back to that tension in a moment. But David, I thought what I might do is show Alice Wong's clip, a couple of dispatches, and then I'll leave the slideshow and get you to talk through the structure of the first public project we presented last year, which was Assembly for the Future. So I'll just introduce, we did 3 Assembly for the Futures events, and our third Assembly for the Future was Alice Wong.
We tell our stories and truths in our own words. We define who we are and our place in the world. We fight to be seen and heard. We live in defiance, with joy and radical acceptance. I too am tired of defending my worth every day to people obsessed with having everything faster, shinier, newer. What can we do? How do we love and hold each other up so we can keep going on as a community? How do we harness our imagination to create a world we want to live in right now and in the future?
Alex, before we go on, I just wonder if you could provide a little bit more context around the Assembly for the Future, just to give our viewers a little sense of the larger project.
Absolutely. So Alice Wong was our third sort of keynote speaker, which we call the first speaker. I'll get David to speak to the structure, but perhaps I can just stop slide sharing for a moment. And David, well, Alice, you can watch the full provocation. We had 3 of these in one of each of the Assembly for the Future events, and Alice was speaking from 2029. So each of our first speakers was providing a provocation from the future. David, do you want to explain how it worked with the respondents and moderators?
So Assembly Assembly for the Future is for want of a better word, it's a format that's been developed out of an artistic dramaturgy that has been ongoing and processing for the last 20 odd years through the work of Not Yet It's Difficult. And it's like a signature dramaturgy. I think Dramaturgy essentially is the operating system of an artwork or a production, and you can apply that to cultural society. In this case, we're looking at it in terms of a cultural provocation, an artistic practice. And so when we think of making a work, we're quite interested in it being sort of rippling out, if you like, from a central premise and then folding participation and collaboration back into that. In Assembly for the Future, the model's really quite simple. Essentially, we have a first speaker who we invite to make a provocation of about 20 minutes. And in Assembly for the Future, it's set in 2029. So in that case, Alice spoke as she named herself the last disabled oracle, and she spoke as the chair of the North American chapter of the Global Disabled Oracle Society. And there, she went for 20 minutes and mapped out what the world was like from the point of view of 2029. So then, to open it up, we have two respondents, and those two respondents are invested in, sometimes not directly, sometimes tangentially, in what Alice might be saying about the future. So they respond either from 2029 or from 2020, however, wherever they feel comfortable. And so what happens is that you develop a kind of a narrative field of discourse that is triangular in shape. It's quite porous, it's messy, it's a series, it's a sort of a field of imagination. And that field is then offered to a series of future building groups. So each future building group is made up of about between 5 and 8 people, and they're led by an artist moderator. And so the moderator takes their group, their future builders, through a process, and each of those processes are framed within the context of the assembly dramaturgy, but they're also quite singular in terms of their own practice as artists. And so what they do is they in a really kind of, and we really choose our artist moderators very, very carefully, because their task is to make people feel comfortable, make them feel included, make them feel like they're in a non-judgmental space, so that they can actually imagine what it might be like from the provocations that they've had by the 3 speakers, to imagine the future of 2029 and what that might be like. After an hour, that each artist moderator speaks to the larger assembly, and each of the future building rooms, there's about 10 of them. So there's an address to the assembly that goes back to the first speaker, back to the 2 respondents, and back to the assembly in general. And then within 3 to 5 days, the artist moderator creates an artwork that is directly in response to their experience of the first speakers, the respondents, and the process that they have participated in with the future builders. And that work is then posted online. And here we've got an example of our artists in residence. Along with the artist moderators, we have 2 artists in residences, and they can basically go into any of the rooms and get a very, very free-form impression of what the assembly was like. And Josh Santaspirito was one of the artists in residence in Alice's in the 3rd assembly, and he made this rather beautiful illustration. One of the moderators, Elle Gibbs, she produced this out of the Assembly for the Future #2, which was a position where, I mean, we're very free in terms of the forms that the artists can use. So this is like a kind of briefing mission, but we would have essays, we would have poems, there would be other artworks, illustrations. The forms are really dependent on, there's an incredibly beautiful poem by Zena Cumpston, who's a First Nations Bakunji woman. And she was an artist moderator on 2 of the assemblies. So then we upload all this onto our website, and we accumulate collectively dispatches from the future, which are a kind of fact of a collectively envisioning process that the assemblies are.
Thanks so much for explaining that. It's fascinating. And, you know, there's a lot of overlap, obviously, with artists and thinking about the future. I mean, artists have long helped us think about the future, and we often say at IFTF, artists are natural futurists. But I was really fascinated in our conversation before we did the webinar about this distinguishing between art as a method versus art as a tool. Could you talk to us about that?
Yeah, it's something that I think when I first started practicing what we might broadly think of as art and social change work, I think I did have quite a simple idea about using art as a tool, making art that has political content. And I think, particularly when I was younger and I was making zines, or I was doing graffiti, or I was doing kind of a lot of political protest, the marriage of art and activism, I think, might have been quite blunt in ways. And I'm certainly not discounting the value of that, because I learned a lot and had a pretty good time. But over the last 20 years, my thinking has deepened quite a lot. And in particular, I think now I feel like it's very important to protect art and the process of making art for its capacity to speak in ways beyond our complete comprehension. I think the mystery of who we are, our interdependence, our way of being with each other, being with the planet, these elements are very important to guard and play. And we've been forced into a corner as artists where we've spent decades defending the value of arts, arguing for how much we can bring in through box office, the numbers of audiences we can reach. And we've made the same mistake, I think, in terms of talking about how instrumentalized we can make art. We can change people with our art. We can re-engage disengaged teenagers. We can teach people about climate change. We can talk about racism. And yes, we can do those things through our art, obviously, and in incredibly powerful ways. But if we spend all of our time trying to argue for the value of our art in that really kind of neoliberal, measurement-based, linear, outcome-orientated way, we start to think about it as a very blunt tool. And the work that we're making will really suffer from that, because we'll be working backwards from this kind of impact point to try and make art that can do this thing. And it's a very different way of thinking about what it is that we're doing. And David, David's written extensively about the impact of neoliberal ideology on art making and art institutions and arts funding. But David, we were talking earlier about, this kind of mechanism of thinking about art in this way, and how it can really be about profit maximization and the state divesting of its own responsibility. Do you want to speak to that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things Western democracies have really suffered from in the last 20 to 30 years as neoliberalism has risen, is that the arts has largely been reduced to a financializing, a financial unit. Excuse me. And so unless it can be financialized, it doesn't have worth or value. So in that space, it means that unless it's actually got a profit outcome, it's not meaningful. So meaning's attached to how much money it makes, which basically reduces art as public good to having zero value at all. In that kind of framework, what happened is, particularly in the UK and I think in the States also, was largely I'll talk about the UK because it's a really good example. Art was used as a tool for social regeneration in the Blair years. So in the 1990s and early noughties, basically, if you had a problem in the neighbourhood, you basically brought in artists who'd never had the skills to actually work in the neighbourhood and regenerate society that way. So it was really very much an instrumental approach and using art as a tool. The other thing, I think some really brilliant writing around this, Claire Bishop talks about it's almost like the terror and the nightmare of participation, where participation in a neoliberal model of democracy basically reduces, the reflex is reduced and in fact numbed, so that citizens are looking for a place to participate. So they open up space for artists to participate in making work, but actually all they're doing is doing the work that the state used to do for them. That's a real shorthand, and I can talk a little bit more about that, but I'll just to frame it. What it means for us is that we've looked at the whole idea of looked at the sort of history of art as a tool and gone, okay, so what do we actually want? Art needs to have an intrinsic value, needs to have a public good. It needs to have we need to acknowledge that artistic practice is a thing in and of itself. And so when you bring people together and to future in this case, what are the elements that you're doing? And largely we've got three elements. It's propositional, it's deliberative, and it's generative. And in that way, the audience isn't just the participant, even though they are participating, they're actually the protagonist. And in that space then, the citizen becomes something other than what they were in that neoliberal frame, and the methodology of art in those spaces is the thing that people take away from them. And so the value of art and artistic practice is enhanced, as well as their capacity to imagine a future.
Yeah.
And
oh, sorry, go ahead, Alex.
well, I might just quickly respond to one of the questions, because it also speaks to, how can you get artists involved in your organizations? And it can kind of speak to this as well. During the New York Climate March about 6 years ago, a lot of artists were engaged to work on that really big, I think 600,000 people ended up walking on that march. And the artists who were working on that, they spoke quite clearly about the idea of they didn't want to be cake decorators. They didn't want to just come in and make banners and puppets and make the march look good. They wanted to have a choreographic, dramaturgical engagement with it. So I think thinking about inviting artists to be artists in residence or artist collaborators, whether it's in a church or a youth organization or a science organization, is a brilliant idea. And then what it means, however, is being open to changing your processes in response to their practice. I think thinking quite carefully about the kind of artist you want to engage. Perhaps you want a musician, perhaps you want a visual artist, etc. The form will also influence the way that it might shift things. But it's really about being open to different processes, and that's really why we've been talking about art as method, not tool, because we're really interested in processes, and why we also invited our moderators from very, very different artistic backgrounds, because we wanted their way of futuring to be very different, and the dispatches that they produce to also be very diverse, because we're very interested in this idea of multiple futures, contradictory futures, messy and non-finished futures, and open futures. So this idea of process is very important, and being willing to be changed in relationship is critical, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this framing really helps us remember that the future is not a destination, it's a journey, and it's a journey we're in, not thinking about. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A. I want to encourage other folks to add questions there as well. I'm going to take one from Catherine Prince. Catherine asks, what stakeholders do you typically engage through your assemblies, and for what purposes? Do you expect or hope that they will follow up in some way or towards some sort of shared goal?
Well, we thought quite a lot about curating our audiences as much as our moderators, because as David said, we weren't thinking of our audiences as passive. We were thinking about them as protagonists and quite active. With this first season of Assembly for the Future, we did spend quite a lot of time engaging First Nations participants, and also people with different access needs, different disabled folks. And we really, part of that was for our own learning in terms of really pushing ourselves in terms of access, but a lot of that was about trying to move beyond the traditional audiences that we would have reached if we'd been doing our event in a town hall live venue, which was originally what we'd been looking at doing before COVID. We tried to work quite cross intergenerationally. So we did a bit of work reaching out to schools and youth groups, younger people, older people, because we wanted those future building rooms to be quite unusual in their makeup. And we were hoping to have people who wouldn't normally necessarily be in dialogue with each other. So, you know, that was quite a challenge that we presented to our moderators, and they did an amazing job. And in terms of what we were hoping afterwards, I think on one level, our aspiration was quite humble in terms of really wanting, I mean, I think one of the to go backwards a little bit, one of the original motivations for the project was recognizing how hard it is and increasingly is becoming for us to imagine other possible futures outside the kind of growing thunder of collapse and disaster around us. And so the very humble hope is that participants would take a slight crack of possibility of thinking about other futures. And then we also did invite other presenters and organisations that we would like to collaborate with in the future and find other ways of presenting the assembly. So there was probably a little bit more of a practical agenda with some of the folks that we'd invited.
One thing to worthwhile mentioning, that last year when we did the Assembly for the Future, each assembly marked a progress further into a 4-month lockdown in Melbourne. So one of the things that we were really mindful of was responding to the kind of emotional temperature that was out there for people that were in Melbourne, and we had a large minority of our people were around Melbourne and the state of Victoria. So that's the bottom part of Australia, and that we were also mindful of trying to create a mini society, a temporary society every time. You know, that for 2 hours you come together as a reflection of what we feel is represents our society, not what we're told is our society. And so we're really curious and committed to the idea of bringing a group of people together that was able to be stimulated by being in the same space with each other, and that stimulation was really provocative in terms of their imagining themselves in another space.
You mentioned just how your work was intersecting with the lockdowns. One of the things that a lot of folks in the Futures community are thinking about is how is the pandemic and how is COVID and the disruptions transforming, people's openness to thinking about different types of futures. I'm curious what your perspective is. I mean, I believe that the thing that we did next was inspired by COVID, and I'm curious if you think people are more open, and if not, what are still the blocks for us to kind of imagine more transformational alternatives?
Well, the practice actually we've been developing the practice for about 4 or 5 years now. And initially it was inspired by work that I did when I was traveling with Naomi Klein on her This Changes Everything project. And David and I have been sort of developing, thinking and sharing readings and talking a lot. And we were actually moving towards a live theatre performance with a spatial sound system that we'd been developing over a year, and realised a few months out that wasn't going to happen. And we looked at many platforms, but we ended up on Zoom. And we created the Assembly for the Future. We didn't want to just recreate the live work online. We knew that we hope one day that we will get to present that work. It's quite a different exploration of the idea and methods. But we also made a values-based decision where we had funding at a time that the arts and were in crisis, and lots of people lost their work. And we wanted to do something as flat and open and participatory as possible. And we wanted to share the money that we had. So we hired, 35 artists to work with over the assemblies as moderators and so on. And I think certainly for me, after we did the 3 assemblies and events, and obviously it was, it was a big rush of adrenaline and a big push to suddenly put these events online and work with a large group, etc. But when we finished in August, I had quite a crash, because living in this creative futuring space actually became quite a buoyant and empowering space. I felt I had quite a lot of agency to deal with the absolute uncertainty of the pandemic, because I was continually talking with others about other possibilities. And we had similar feedback from moderators, and we had similar feedback from Future Building audience members that, surprisingly, given the upheaval that we were in, surprisingly, this practice of futuring did lift people and lift their spirits. And it's not easy. And sometimes, we heard feedback about some of the future building groups struggled more to get going, or some people said, look, I can't think about the future right now. The present's too hard. So I don't want to gloss over that. But we did find that when we could hold the space in the right way, and I think the triangulation of the first speaker and the respondents, and the fact that the audience gets to watch that first before jumping in, really works with getting people going. So yeah, I found it really just such a great process for my mental health as well as my creativity.
I'm seeing some more questions in the Q&As. Please feel free to add more, but want to go to Deborah France, who asked, what key elements would you strive for, or alterations might you suggest to create the similar kinds of impact within a corporate or inside of a company audience?
That's maybe it's a good way to approach that quite analytically then. So what is the world of a corporation, and what are the dynamics of the corporation? How is the organisation designed? Generally, large corporations are designed hierarchically. They're vertically conceived and vertically integrated. So in order to go into that kind of a space, you'd have to know quite a lot about the way that the company's methodology, the way in which the sensibility of the organisation and the design of the organisation, before you would then adjust the kind of dramaturgical approach for that company or corporation. And essentially that's the same answer that you would apply for any social entity when you're taking the work into different spaces. There's no formula, essentially. One needs to be very responsive to the system that is in operation in order for you to be able to alter the DNA of the system. And it's quite possible to do that in a way that is not aggressive. I don't think a lot of kind of people go, change agents go into organisations and they go, well, this needs to go here, this needs to go there, and they go in, they're like a tornado, and then they leave and the company's a mess. I think one of the things about this is that, it's seeing society as a whole, and companies and business are part of that. How you address it though, and the kind of values that you bring to it, the corporations need to be very receptive. What one doesn't want to be doing, we've talked about this a fair bit, we wouldn't be going into an environment like that where our values were compromised. The receptive faculty of the corporation needs to be very positive and open and understand the dynamics of what you might be proposing.
That's really interesting, David. I wonder if you could just, if I could ask a follow-up question to that. So it sounds like I'm hearing you say that it's important to kind of set up the expectations and build a relationship to begin with. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that and how to kind of begin the conversation to set the right settings and make sure that there's understanding around the work that's going to be explored.
I think one of the things, change is kind of like a word like innovation. You know, there's in some spaces the meaning of the word has been sort of emptied because it's so used and turned into something that must be done. It's almost like it's been commodified, turned into a commodity. A warning bell is the language that the people that are interested in talking to them might be using. So, and you actually need to unpack the language. So if I use the word change and you use the word change, and we find actually that the word is the same, but the meaning behind it is something quite other, then you need to kind of resolve that, because therein lies a tension which could be productive, but it actually might be negative, and it might actually mean that it's not a good match. That in fact the entity isn't really interested in altering or shifting or progressing. The entity might just be interested in kind of art washing.
Performing change.
Formative. We had a question from Elizabeth earlier. She mentioned when you were talking about the neoliberal art making, she said it reminds her of Tony Fry's defuturing philosophy. She's curious if that's something that you based any of your thinking on.
It's not something that's come across my radar, I have to say. So I'm going to look it up. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Maybe Elizabeth, you can share a link in our chat.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Mark asks, he's curious more specifically around using theatrical techniques and methods to create participatory features. Could you talk a little bit more about, I know you've talked a little bit about that, but I think there's more interest in that method.
One of the things that we thought quite a lot about when we were trying to find a platform other than Zoom, but we came back to Zoom, was how to make it feel not like every other Zoom. And part of it was these lovely backgrounds, and each of our moderators and first speakers had one. But we also decided to have a foyer and an usher to the future. And we were also guided through the assembly for the future by another version of myself known as the Keeper of Time. And we used some very simple devices with the usher and the Keeper of Time to try and create quite a different atmosphere in the Zoom space. And as David's sort of spoken to, the structure of the event itself. But David, this has been a lot of what you've thought about. Beyond the usher and the Keeper of Time and the structure, what other techniques do you think that you could speak to?
I think when we had started the conversation, we were really looking for balance. So what's the engagement with the theatre and the platform? So what does the platform allow you to do? So one of the reasons, for example, we decided on Zoom was that we felt that the things that we were able to do well and could be understood and communicated to an audience actually suited the kind of parameters of Zoom, so that when people entered into that space, we were able to, it operated more like a portal, for example, into another world. And so the theatrical elements that we decided upon were ones that allowed us to give a new space for our audience, our participants, our publics to come into and feel comfortable, not to feel overwhelmed by the technology. So they needed to be, so there needed to be a level of humour in there. I often say that in Australia, people won't take you seriously unless you're humorous. It's one of the things for us. There's got to be this sort of level of levity and kind of, just a sort of, you can't be too schmick. You can't be too over something. It's got to be, you've got to find a place where most of the audience just goes, oh, I'm not going to be judged. I feel good. I know what I'm supposed to do. Oh, now what am I thinking? And that's really that kind of balance that, you know, a lot of our conversations, there are lots of different things that we probably could have done, but we really just decided on, you know, having a foyer, having an usher. We had a really lovely, one of our collaborators, he's got very, you know, engaging personality, makes people feel comfortable. He can talk, you know, fill in space, people feel comfortable. And then we go into another space where you actually time shift. You go into 2029, and that's the keeper of the times place. So the chronology of that experience for an audience has to make them feel challenged, but also feel like they don't have to play catch up at, you know, at any point along the way. And so if we were going to go and, as we think about different versions of manifestations of Assembly for the Future, it's always in relation to context and the platform, and then the kind of the menu of possibilities that we have from performative and media backgrounds.
We'll probably have time for one or two more audience questions. So if there's any burning questions on your mind, please put them in the Q&A. I wanted to ask, you brought up just Australian point of view. I'm curious, what kind of unique perspectives do you think being based in Australia? I know you've talked about Indigenous cultures, but I'm just kind of curious, just at large, you know, what has being based in Australia provided for you in terms of a unique perspective? Is there an active futures community in Australia?
We were having an interesting conversation yesterday about dominant Australian narratives as opposed to who we might truly be. So we have a dominant narrative that is that we are relaxed and we believe in what we call a fair go, which means, you know, justice and equality, essentially. Mateship, friendship, we have this sort of, this idea of like, it's all very relaxed, it's beautiful, we've got the beach, we're friends with everyone, it's a great place. And that is the kind of simple kind of trope that gets trotted out a lot. And it's actually very contradicted by our very powerful police force, border security, surveillance capitalism, carceral state, and our history. And so it is like, I think, all nations that are, as Edward Said said, you know, nations and narrations, it is made up of lots and lots of complex stories and contradictory ones. So working with and against those, and some of that is about which voices we're listening to, or, you know, after Haraway, which futures, who's in the room, who's having the conversation. But yeah, there are some pretty big and contradictory things happening that are probably particular to here. But I think, you know, there are some very strong parallels with other settler colonies around the world, like the US and Canada and New Zealand, etc. So yeah, I think being mindful of those, but not falling into the trap of those, and drawing on them, but trying to do things separate from them, is the challenge with this kind of narrative work and play.
I want to ask, what's next for the things we did next? What's the future for your collective? And yeah, what are you hoping to achieve in both the near and the long-term futures?
We've got the first thing we're doing a project for a design week. We have a big program called Melbourne Design Week, and we've commissioned 5 designers to respond to any one of the dispatches of the future that came out of last year's Assembly for the Future. And that's called The Things We Made Next. And that's going to be premiering in end of March. And that's a really neat project that was sort of instigated by Elliot Rich, who's the visual designer as part of the practice. And she came up with this idea that she wanted to kind of ask a set of questions to designers about care and community, and to kind of look at the way in which designers operate in the world and how they might operate in the world. And the next one is, and Alex can talk a little about this, is very excited about a sound feature, and Alex is the lead artist on a sound feature, the title of which I think we can say, Alex, is that true? The Planting. So Alex, do you want to have a chat about that?
Yeah. So I was lucky enough to get a Bertha Foundation Challenge Fellowship. So spent a lot of this year exploring responses to climate change, creative responses to climate change. And the culminating work is going to be a sound piece we're referring to as a sound feature called The Planting, which is, again, a speculative sound work set in 2029 in Australia, exploring large-scale project of repair. So once that's completed later in the year, we'll definitely link back to your networks. We're thinking quite creatively about how to distribute it digitally so that when there's a large weather pattern or storm in your area, you'll receive an alert to listen to it in accompaniment by ambient sound. So and it's an interesting time also to be making art and wondering how arts funding and arts commissions are going to go. And I would like to think that our festivals and presenters are going to take really big risks and commission really interesting and bold and important works. And some will, but some will probably take a scarcity approach and go for old classics or what they think of as safe work. So it'd be interesting to see what resources are around. We're hoping to present future versions of the Assembly. We'd like to make a book of the future. We've got a lot of different ideas, but we see this as a really long-term practice that we may ebb and flow out of around opportunities and resources and other possibilities. Yeah, and we would love feedback, things people think we should read, look at, etc. Because we know there's a lot of wisdom in the virtual room today, and for those watching later.
Yeah, so we'll be saving the chat. We'll be harvesting a number of resources, or all the links that were shared in there today. Be publishing that with
there is just one thing I will just very quickly throw in, because I did see a comment from Dom, who I believe is a very old collaborator of mine, who may have asked the question. But one thing I just want to point people to have a look at as well is the practice of impact producing, which I find quite valuable. This is just a very specific and strategic way of thinking about distribution of creative works so that they can be impactful or connect with campaigns and partners, etc. There's a lot of thinking about how that might speak to some of these questions about engagement with churches and corporations, etc., to think about partnering. But the reason I mention it is because having an explicit practice of impact producing, and there's a great Doc Society impact field guide we can share, is that it protects the art. So here is the artwork, and then here is your impact strategy. And by separating those things, it gives more space to the creative work to breathe and not be instrumentalized in the ways we warned against earlier.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I just noticed that some questions there in the chat. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for spending time with us today, sharing your stories and about your methods for developing stories collectively. It's really been fascinating to be able to get to meet you guys and chat today. We hope to continue the conversation and stay in touch. I'm glad we had this excuse to reach out to you and make the connection. And I'm going to put up on a screen share here. If you'd like to learn more about the Things We Did Next, you can go to thethingswedidnext.org. If you would like to follow up and learn more about Alex, you can go to echotango.org or David at notyet.com.au. You can find out more about our Foresight Talks at the link on the screen here. And you can also email us at foresight.essentials@iftf.org if you have any questions. And this webinar will be available on our Foresight Talks webpage just in 1 week. And also just want to remind everyone, don't forget our IFTF Foresight Talks webinar next in March. We are having, Dr. Gechi Kari Sabina, a founding director of the Southern Africa node of the Millennium Project, who will talk about her personal journey in futures thinking, including her current participation in a growing agenda to build futures literacy and decolonize futures starting in Africa. We will explore her critical issues, insights, and experiences that she thinks may be pointing us towards new questions and ideas about foresight practices and capabilities. Dr. Sabina is a scholar practitioner based in Johannesburg, working in the intersection between people, place, and socio-technical change. Her work is mainly in Africa and the global South, and she has a diverse background spanning a range of foresight, policy, innovation, practice topics, and has worked extensively in R&D, government, and civic organizations. So please tune in March for that. And with that, I would like to just say thanks to Alex and David. Thanks for joining us today, and thanks everyone who joined us in the audience.
Thanks,
everyone. Thanks for the invitation.